What's up, Leron here, and today we're going to talk about advanced wash control in watercolor painting. What's up, Leron here. Thank you for joining me in another video. As I mentioned, today we're going to talk about advanced wash control, and what I want to do, this is the highly weighted for follow-up of the previous video in which I talked about blending edges. So this is the follow-up that I said. I want to do several scenarios of different wetness, levels of wetness, and show you what happens, how the color behaves. So what we're going to do is show how two very wet washes mix together. Then I'm going to show you how a wet and dry wash mix together. Then I'm going to show you how a dry and a wet wash mix together, and finally two very dry washes mix together. And then I'm going to demonstrate how this all works in the grand scheme of things using different patches of paint. Okay, and I think this is really an important just knowledge and experience to have. You have to really play around with the paint to get to these insights on your own. I really hope you will enjoy this one. Let's get started. Okay, so let's start going over these scenarios that you may run into. So the first thing I want us to try is to just do a plain meeting point of two very wet washes, or just brush strokes. And we're gonna use Phthalo blue and quinacridone rose. Okay, these two work really well together. So now I have a really watered down wash. And I'm going to show you what happens when this watered down wash, very wet, meets another wet wash, okay? So I'm just placing in some phthalo blue here. Now I'm going to grab the quinacridone rose. I'm going to do it here, the mixing, but I do want you to see some of the mixing, so I'm just going to pick up the palette for a moment because you need to see I'm bringing in more water into the mix, okay? Now this is really watered down as well, and when these two are going to meet, we're going to have a bit of a merging, okay? Every side is going to merge into the other, and hopefully you can see this, and let me hold it so that you can better see this with the other angle. Hopefully you can see how these two start to mingle together. And this is what happens when you have two very wet washes, I guess. Now I'm gonna show you again. Let's use another watered down, but maybe let's try and have it a little more pigmented, less grayed out, and see what we can get, okay? With time you'll see these two slowly merge together. It also depends on if you have an even surface or maybe it's at an angle, okay? But in any case, I'm gonna put a bit of the very wet. I'm gonna just pour water directly in it, okay, to make it even wetter. And I'm gonna come back with some of the quinacridone rose, again very watered down, but trying to get it to be a strong color. I'm gonna let these two touch together, and you can see how really they start to merge together here. So this is what will happen when you use two wet paints or very wet paints. Now we can even supplement the merging together by adding more water here and just letting them, you'll see mini blossoms, but that doesn't really matter. It's like really mini scale blossoms, and you can see how they kind of move together in between one another. Next up I'm going to show you the very opposite scenario, and that is when you do very dry paint and very dry paint. Okay, not that common really, but I just want to show you the extremes so that you can figure out what's in the middle. So I'm just touching it's Winsor blue, but it's phthalo blue, and I'm just placing it here. So this is a pretty dry, or at least a drier wash than the previous one. Now I'm going to do the very same with the quinacridone. It takes some time to get rid of the water, okay? So I may dab it on the towel here or something like this, but now I'm gonna place these two together. And especially if we'll zoom into that area, you will see how the line of blending is really, it's really small. There's no gradation at all. Let me zoom in on that. So you can see how up close the whole part where they gradually move from one another doesn't really exist. Now if you look at this one, we have this movement. Now I want to show you two other extreme scenarios, and those are not extreme, but two other scenarios where one paint is wetter than the other. Okay, I think it's important to show that as well. So this is what I'm going to show you. We're going to start maybe with a very wet blue and then add a dry red, okay? And this will give you a good idea of what to expect to happen. So I'm starting out with, again, a very wet blue wash, okay? And I'm gonna show you here, wetting it a lot. And I'm just gonna place it in here. So you can see it's fairly light. I'm gonna add a bit more water. I'm gonna really soak up the paper. Now, so this area is rather wet, and if I'll hold the paper up a bit at an angle, you may be able to see this. Let me try it out. You see it's really wet, it's got a sheen and everything. So now I'm gonna add dry red into that, okay? And I have to do it quickly before it dries out so that I can actually demonstrate the effect. So now I have pretty dry red here. And notice what happens. Okay, you can see this. It's like the red kind of stays in its spot and some of the blue starts pouring into that, okay? And some of the red also starts maybe mingling with the blue. Probably what happens is I'm gonna correct myself. What usually happens is that the paint moves to the wetter area. So because the wetter area is the blue, the red moves into the blue. Okay, I'm correcting myself. The red moves into the blue. Next up, I'm gonna show you the other way around. I'm gonna use a very dry blue and then a wet red, and you'll see how the blue moves more into the red. Okay, you can especially see this here at the bottom. I'm gonna lift it up for you just so you can better see this. You can really see it in the bottom where the red seeps into the blue. Okay, so this is generally what you'll get. Next up, I want to show you again the opposite case. So what we're gonna do is have a fairly dry blue. So we're gonna keep the direction the same. This time we're gonna have a dry blue. So you can see here a very, very dry blue. And then we're gonna add right next to it a very wet quinacridone rose. So I'm picking up the paint here, placing it here and allowing it to be really wet. And once I'm gonna put this in here, what we can expect to happen is to have some of the blue move into the wet area, okay? And this, again, the color isn't that strong because I'm using a very wet mixture, but you can see how the results differ. Of course, the paints themselves look a little different because I'm using a more pigmented version of each of those with every case, okay? But this is what happens, and it's the same thing as I showed you in the edge control and blending control video. So you can blend this edge by, I cleaned the brush and then dried it up. So because I'm coming in with a drier area, I'm blending the edge. But if I want the edge to move, I'll come back with a wetter brush, like really, this one is really wet. And I'm just gonna touch it, and you see I expand the border, or the borders within the paint can move, okay? And this is really important to understand. So the same principle applies here. I'm gonna show you once again, maybe now we'll use two very saturated paints, but still keep them both pretty wet, not as wet as before, and you will see this effect again. So I'm gonna just lay down here some of the phthalo blue, and it's a very, it's still a wet one. It's a little stronger than the previous ones, of course, but it's still wet. Then I'm gonna do the same very rich and wet quinacridone rose, and you can see that they both start to seep into one another, and of course some of that will depend on the pigment itself, okay? So you'll find maybe that some paints pour into others a little more, some a little less, but then this is what you'll have happening, and you see the gradation if you compare it to the top example here, and then you go into this one that's very tight, and then this one is middle. It's kind of in the middle. It still blends a bit, but then again not really. And of course again it depends on the angle at which you hold your paper. So if I'm gonna do the opposite, let's say I'm gonna use this blue here, and because I have a very slight angle, I can even make the angle a bit stronger, just putting something under this thing. And I'll show you how it kind of flows, okay? So you already get the bead. Now I'm gonna use, again, a wet quinacridone rose, and you can see how the two flow together because of gravity. Now if I'm gonna do the same, but this time I will use two drier washes, so a bit of blue, but very dry. Okay, very, very dry blue. And with that, I'm just cleaning the brush, going back and grabbing some very dry rose. Sorry, I had to put it underneath. So you can see there's not much flow there. Okay, look at this spot, especially in particular. You don't see a lot of flow because the paint, of course, is thicker. It's less flowy in general, but still. Now let's try something interesting. Let's have a very wet color at the top. So let's say a wet blue at the top, but then get relatively dry red, okay? And we'll see how that goes, because then we're combining two different factors. We've got the wet on the one hand, but the bottom part is a little drier, and we'll see how the two coexist. So I'm gonna just grab a bit of dry red here, and I'm gonna place it in. So you can see the flow happens, but it's a bit blocked, obstructed. It's like the blue needs to penetrate through several points, okay? Now, if on the other hand, I would have used, let's say, a very strong blue here, and then also a very wet red, like we kind of saw in the beginning, but this time I made the blue a little stronger, you will get the flow. You see how it immediately flows down, and it will take time to be more noticeable, but you can already see this effect. Okay, so this is basically it. Now what I want to do is show you just how the patches work again. So I'm gonna change the angle for a moment. Okay, so just like that other video where I showed you how to mix pure paints on the paper, this time I want to demo to you the how to do that, but now I want you to look at it from a different lens. I want you to look at it from the lens of how wet every color is and how that affects the overall maybe composition or mixture, okay? So I'm just grabbing a bit of blue, very strong now, okay? I'm just gonna lay it down here like this. Allow it to do what it does. I don't have now an angle, it's just the paper is horizontally. Perfectly horizontal. And now I'm gonna add a bit of a wetter red, okay? So just a bit of a wet red. And I'm gonna place it down here and let it does what it does. Okay, now you can see immediately the red is less dominant because the blue immediately moves towards the wetter surface. So if I'm gonna add a bit of a stronger red, just next to it, maybe to this side, immediately it has more presence, okay? It has less presence to this one also because it's wetter, but also because the blue immediately moved in and mixed with it, okay? Next up, I want to try and add a bit of yellow. So I'm going to grab some yellow here. Now, yellow is weak as it is, so I don't want to water it down too much. And I'll try to pick up some non-contaminated yellow as well, but it doesn't really matter. It's contaminated with that same Winsor blue. And I'm just going to place it around here. And you can see how that flows together, immediately flowing into the wetter area that we placed earlier, okay? And you can already understand why it's important to be aware of that, because if you'd want the red to preserve its purity, then you'd use a stronger, less wet, let's say, mixture, a drier mixture. But here, because we use the dry mixture, this is what we get, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Now I'm gonna grab some burnt sienna. I don't know why the air condition does a bit of noise. Hopefully it doesn't interrupt it too much. I'm gonna use a kind of a wet, but not too wet burnt sienna. Then maybe let's add a bit of a drier burnt sienna. It's hard to get the wash to be drier just by going back into the paint. Sometimes you really need to clean the brush and wipe it on a towel. Just dropping some things around here. Drop it on a towel and come back with maybe a drier brush and then pick up the paint that you wanted. And then it will be much stronger. Although I guess the burnt sienna here is not that strong. It's Daniel Smith. So in any case, this is what you get, and you see how these all mix together. If we'd want to have the red with more presence, again, we have to use a less watered down version of it, because otherwise all the other paints are going to move into that and contaminate it. Get it? So I really hope this is helpful. Let's just add a bit of blue here to the side. Let's add just a wet blue, and you'll see how, again, it loses its dominance just because I'm using a very wet paint, and everything is gonna move into that, okay? So this is it, and I hope you learned something new from this demo just regarding, you know, how different levels of wetness influence the paint. Now, if you look at all of the things we did here, we've got these two that were really wet, these two again, and they both lost kind of their purity and authenticity. We've got this that were medium, let's say, value and medium wet, and so we have this line of merging here in the middle. We've got this one was really wet and this one was drier, so the drier paint seeped into the wet. We've got the opposite example here, and of course it all depends on the pigment, and it depends on how it behaves and the angle at which the surface is at. Like these were done angled, these were done flat pretty much, and then you get to see how the wetness of the paint influences the way it disperses within the general context of your painting, okay? And this is really important. Because it does influence that, and if you want to preserve a hard edge, you really need to know when to use a bit of a drier wash, a bit of a wetter wash. So whenever you come you begin to start a new wash, I want you to really think about what you want to achieve with that. Do you want more controlled edges? Do you want to have a little less control? Do you want things to blend a bit? Do you want the edges to blend? And then calculate the level of wetness that's required based on that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Let's wrap up this video. So this is it for today's tutorial. I've been really wanting to do this one for a while now and talk about, you know, the more advanced aspects of how to mix the colors in terms of the wetness, okay, not in terms of the colors or the pigment or anything like that, but more in like knowing when I put this wash, how it will react to the surrounding, to anything that touches it. This is really important if you want to maintain control when you want it, and then let go of control when you choose to do so as well. Okay, so again, one of these core basic techniques, I think. What I'm gonna do now, I have quite a few of these videos, is I'm gonna create a playlist of painting exercises. I do have a playlist of sketching exercises, but I don't have a painting exercises playlist, so I'm gonna do that, and we'll put this one and the previous part from like a few months ago and other videos that are relevant to that in there. I think it will be really useful, especially if it's like beginner exercises and things of that nature. These are the things you really want to work on once you train your eye to draw properly and to maybe recognize values accurately. Once you have that down and you can do something competently in that sense, you want to go over to techniques, you know, the watercolor painting techniques, and learn how paint works. And it's just water. This is what it's all about. Watercolor is about water. The water is used to move the paint. That's the vehicle. And the more you understand that, the more successful you will become. So I want to thank you so much for watching. I'm going to put some interesting links in the description box below. For example, my Instagram account, where you can see works in progress and just me documenting my journey of learning how to paint and drawing also, and sketches and a lot of things that I do, and also some personal updates. I'm going to put a link to my podcast as well, to my beginner's drawing course, all of the relevant stuff really that you may want to check out. And I will talk to you again in another video. Until then, take care.